Good evening, everyone. It is so exciting to be with you this evening. Thank you so much for joining us. For those of you who just have come in from watching Influence at the Encounters Film Festival, welcome. To those of you who are joining us otherwise, we're so happy to have you here as well. On behalf of Daily Maverick, who's hosting this event, Caveat Legal, who's sponsoring it, and our producers, Storyscope here in Johannesburg and I Steal Film in Montreal, I'm Diana Neille. I'm here with my colleague and co-director, Richard Poplak, and of course, the inimitable Bill Browder. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, Bill.
Great to be here. Good to see you guys.
Rich, you want to kick us off maybe? Just give us a sense of what the conversation is going to look like this evening.
Absolutely. First of all, Bill, thanks for joining us. This is an amazing honor to have you with us tonight. I guess, as everyone's now seen, and we're not going to do too much, introduction of a film that everybody's just watched, but I think the conversation we'd like to steer tonight is the fact that you can't actually have corruption or a gangster state without disinformation. The two things are married for life. And it's kind of the reason we wanted to speak to you tonight is because we think there's a fascinating crossover between the work that you've done and the work that we've done on Influence that kind of explicates how corruption and disinformation are completely intertwined.
Well, let me start out by just congratulating the two of you on this movie. I didn't just watch it; I watched it last night. So I've had a day to kind of ruminate and absorb it. And I have to say that I mean, it kind of made me feel bad to see all of these people, starting with Lord Bell. Just in this amoral, and he calls it amoral, but it's immoral, this immoral world where they're using their influence and their skills and highly skilled people to do really bad stuff. And I guess I wanted to add, before we get too deep into the conversation about corruption and disinformation, I'm just amazed that a guy whose job it is to what he calls reputation management would basically subject himself and put himself in a position where he ruined his reputation. I mean, I've read the articles, but I mean, I'm astounded that this guy went on with you, and not just once or twice, but all through this show, and made himself out to be, as close to evil as you could possibly get. And I'm just wondering what his how did you get him to do that? I mean, it's remarkable. It was very raw and honest.
Absolutely. Well, Richard was the one who went to London to convince him, so maybe you should take this one, Rich.
Yeah, I was dispatched by our producers and by Diana to go to London to track Lord Bell down, which I eventually did after 3 or 4 days. Showed up at his townhouse, introduced myself. He knew exactly who I was. And I said, look, what we want to do, and we're doing it regardless of your participation, is make a bare knuckle film about Bell Pottinger. It would benefit from your participation, and it would benefit from the fact that you get to have your say, and we'll give you as much time as you need. He said, well, what are you asking me for? I said, around about 3 days. He gave us 5 days.
Wow.
We left our equipment in his house. We basically camped out, nearby. We're at his house in the morning, left in the evening, smoked every one of the 60 cigarettes that he smoked a day with him, and basically just let him talk and let him implicate himself. As we said to him, you get to have your say. Of course, we interjected when he was not being truthful. And of course, we fact-checked everything he said, and the stuff that is in the film is sourced. But that was it. And I think what he expected is that this would end up, by dint of his charm, would end up being, a hagiography. I guess he thought he could spin us. Maybe it was a cigarette smoke. It didn't work.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I was going to say, in a certain way, he wasn't even trying to spin you, though. He was just, I mean, and it's almost as if people who get into that business become so inured to the evil of it that he didn't even sort of know it was evil. I mean, I'm just
That to me makes more sense, because what he is he's a master tactician. He's a chess player. So Tim respects people who know what they're talking about and can back it up. And he will always find a way. So he'll give you one version of the story, and if you've done your homework and you can call him out on it, he'll just answer you more honestly, maybe honestly. But the point is that he respects you for the fact that you played the game, and he likes it, and it gets him talking. And so I think if you show interest, if he immediately realized that we'd obviously read up, and we knew pretty much everything, we knew what to ask him and why. And for that reason, I think he just enjoyed playing the game with us, as you say. I mean, at one point we had this gigantic light in the streets of London pointing straight through his living room window. And I mean, he just kind of drank it all in. I think he's someone who really enjoys the spotlight, and he freely admits it. He enjoys being close to power, and he enjoys the spotlight that comes from that. So, yeah.
Like when you were going through the Pinochet, his like first big, foreign assignment, and he said, yeah, Pinochet killed a lot of people, but I had nothing to do with those. I had nothing to do with that. It was just like, well, I mean,
Pinochet was a guy who needed some reputation management work. He liked Pinochet. All the dead people had nothing to do with him. Why not help him out? His ethos, and the ethos of a lot of the people who work in geopolitical reputation management, not all of them, but a lot, is that these are people with problems. Let's go help them fix their problems. And by the way, just like lawyers, or just like somebody in a legal bind, everyone is deserving of a chance to have their say, regardless of the fact that there are massive power imbalances in this relationship. Regardless of how much Lord Bell's services cost, the fact of the matter is that, hey, it's all good. Everyone deserves a shot.
Yeah, I mean, I've heard that a lot in all the fights that I've had with these Russian influence peddlers. That there's this guy here in London, Lord Goldsmith, and Lord Goldsmith was hired by a Russian named Andrei Pavlov, who was about to be put on the European Parliament's Magnitsky sanctions list. And some leaked emails disclosed that Lord Goldsmith got £75,000 to advocate to the European Parliament to keep Pavlov off this list. And when he was challenged by journalists, he gave that answer, which is everybody's entitled to a defense. And it's like, well, no, that's not true. Yes, people are entitled to a legal defense, but no one's entitled to lobbying defense. That's absurd. I've not read that in any. There's no sort of legal definition or Hippocratic oath or anything like that defines that. And this is some effectively spin or nonsense that these people come up with. There was something else that I noticed in the film, and I wanted to ask you about because it just kind of stuck with me, which is so Lord Bell and Bell Pottinger apparently received $500 million of fees from the United States government on the Iraq file. And I would imagine that was so much money why were they then working for $100,000 a month on the Gupta file? I just didn't understand that. I mean, they had their fortunes that low at that point that they did that. It didn't make any sense to me as a, my previous life before I was a campaigner was as a businessman, and it's just those two numbers don't add up.
Well,
look, I think the reality is that
you're moving in the wrong business circles. These guys loved money. Loved it.
Yeah, a lot. Bath and the stuff. Look, I think it was just a case that they became a very big firm towards the middle of the 2000s and later. And I think they had so many contracts. If you look at the sheer breadth of their client list, you get a sense of just how many people they work for, both on government side and multinationals. And so I think that Iraq campaign probably, I certainly don't think it was something that was on the table. Take $500 million. Here you go. I think it was something that over a 7-year period they kind of racked that bill up, and our source actually told us there in Iraq that the information that we had was that it was a lot more than half a billion. It was closer to 800 or 900 million, which is a lot of money, particularly for the kind of work they were doing, which, as those of you watching will know, wasn't very effective in Iraq. So yeah, I think £100,000 a month is I wouldn't sneeze at that myself. So I mean, I suppose. it depends on the length of the campaign. And yeah, to some extent, by that point, James Henderson was the CEO of Bill Browder, and I think the culture of the company had started to change. Things had started to shift, and internally, it wasn't looking too peachy. So who knows what those forces were. There's an interesting comment here from Raymond. He says, what does he say? He says, Bell and Roger Stone were in the same WhatsApp group. Very much that same sense of that type of work, political advising, and in some ways we did feel that it would be good to interview a Roger Stone character. Unfortunately, he was in jail for some of the time we were filming, so not in jail, but he was being indicted. But yeah,
well, they were they scrabbled for every pound, and they fought internally for every pound. One of the reasons I think the company imploded is the fact that there was so much scrabbling among the partners for billing, that they just crawled all over each other like rats and started eating each other.
So the other thing that really struck me, and I mean it, from your film, but just from the whole story, is that this what I would almost describe as almost like a fake industry group, the PR self-regulatory agency or whatever they called themselves, actually regulated in this particular case. I mean, I can't imagine. I mean, there's so many other bad guys doing bad stuff out there, and I've sseen with my own eyes in relation to Russia, the fact that this
sure.
And what would you attribute that to? Why did they act in this one case and not in anything else?
I think there was an emotional reaction amongst the British with regard to the fact that this campaign was so racially divisive. Yeah. Was it the worst campaign that Bill Browder conducted in its years? The answer to that question is absolutely not. Was it the worst campaign being conducted? Or should I let me rephrase that? Is it worse than a lot of the campaigns that are being conducted in London right now, the center of the whitewashing industry?
Yeah.
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
They were just so clunky, so greedy, so crass that I think the PRCA, and keep this is a regulatory body for public relations.
Right.
I mean, the standards are pretty low. It was so crass and just so clumsy that they said, you know what, we have to make an example of these guys. This kind of thing can't go on. And I think there was that sort of emotional reaction from, mostly a bunch of white dudes sitting on the board going, well, this would be terrible. White people are nice too. We have to do something about this. So I think there was a very, very emotional reaction to this Bill Browder campaign.
Before we carry on, I just want to address something. There's a lot of questions right now from our viewers. Thanks so much, everybody, for engaging. It's so nice to see everybody weighing in. Just a couple of questions about where to see the film. We know that there's a lot. Obviously, there's a lot of demand off the back of this chat, this Q&A, to see it. And beforehand, the screenings that have taken place this evening and will take place next week are part of the Encounters Film Festival, as I mentioned. And because it's a local film festival, they've had to limit the seating because of distribution. Our deals with local TV companies. So we will be screening Influence on ETV in the next couple of weeks for our South African audiences. Our international audiences, please understand COVID has affected our distribution pretty heavily, but we do plan to be on a streamer or a broadcaster near you soon. So just keep on look at our social media for updates, and hopefully that addresses that. Now onto the conversation.
So the other thing which I thought was interesting, and where my work and your work have collided or merged, is on the whole Gupta story. As you're probably aware, or maybe other people here aren't aware. So my whole the last 10 years have been spent trying to get the Magnitsky Act in place in different countries. The Magnitsky Act is legislation that freezes assets and bans visas to the United States of kleptocrats and human rights violators. And the United States passed the Global Magnitsky Act in 2016, and we were really afraid that they weren't going to use the act when it was first put in place. And in fact, there was a big argument about like one word in the law, just one word, which like delayed it for a year. And the one word was the word may versus shall. And so the word, the law ended up saying the president may sanction people who do all these terrible things, as opposed to the president shall sanction. And so when the law was passed, we thought, well, this is great. We'll have a law that will never be used because the president may as opposed to shall, and presidents don't like to sanction people. And all of a sudden, the United States Treasury started sanctioning all sorts of people all over the world. And I've spent enough time in South Africa to know the Gupta story well before seeing your film, and knowing the Zuma corruption and the Gupta corruption. And I was then amazed and overjoyed that the Gupta brothers ended up getting sanctioned under the Global Magnitsky Act. And so my work then has merged into or overlapped with your work in terms of the whole Gupta story. But it'd be interesting for me to hear from you just how you see the Guptas and how you see, where you think the Magnitsky Act fits into the overall picture of justice and accountability and so on.
Bill, the tragedy of South Africa right now is that we simply don't have the prosecutorial or policing capacity to fully track down, chase down, and jail the Guptas, to get them extradited into South Africa. There's also roadblocks there with regard to that process. So, as much as every single South African wants to do this internally, I think across political stripes, South Africans would love to see the Guptas in jail. There simply isn't any capacity here. Now, what Jacob Zuma did was textbook gangster state, because effectively he gutted out policing, he gutted out the security services, he transformed the security cluster into an agent for graft and for personal enrichment. He was the head, effectively, of a mafia state. And one of the first things you do when you're head of a mafia state is that you've got the prosecutorial abilities. So our National Prosecuting Authority, God bless them, is doing everything they can to rebuild from effectively 9 years of complete disorder and trashing. So in other words, we effectively have to look outside for salvation. And that's where the Magnitsky Act is effectively such a salve. No prideful South African wants to see anyone from outside writing in here to take care of our business for us. I think I can say that with complete conviction. But at the same time, we also need a conviction. Right. We need to see these guys behind bars. So I think there is the intention of the act, if I may, was to provide an alternative for weak states to effectively take down agents of corruption. Yeah. And so in this case, I think it's a pretty fair use of the act. And I think there's millions of South Africans. I don't want to speak for them, but I certainly think the sense is that it's been a bit of a salvation.
Absolutely.
And were they able to take the money that they made and run, or is that money stuck in frozen? You
mean our money?
Yeah, the
our
money
that is our cash.
Yeah. All the money that was paid to them that they accumulated in your country. They were able to take your money and run?
Bits and bobs are frozen. Lots and lots of it has been offshored.
And they spent a ton of it on a bunch of weddings as well. So I think a lot of significant millions went to a wedding here in South Africa and a wedding in India. And we're talking tens of millions of
they're wedding specialists. Yeah, they do a great wedding. So that's the other thing. It's not just the Guptas. We have many, many offshoring specialists in this country. And that's another one of the tragedies of the post-apartheid era, is that so much cash has been offshored out of South Africa, much of it legally, Bill, but a lot of it illegally as well. The Gupta jet was known in certain circles for moving bundles and bundles of cash, our cash, out of this country.
Wow. It's really tough.
There's another point here that Johan van Lochenberg makes, which I think is a good one, and it ties in where he's saying, why do you think, or rather, where are the copycat Bell Pottingers still visible in South Africa today? I mean, I don't even know if there are copycat Bell Pottingers because what's still happening is straight from the Bell Pottinger playbook. No one's even had the decency to reinvent the wheel. I mean, last week you had former backbencher in Parliament turned finance minister for 4 days, Des van Rooyen, in front of the Zondo Commission, which is our commission looking into corruption under the Zuma administration, using the exact turn of phrase that Bell Pottinger, rose from the apartheid days, which was this whole white monopoly capital narrative, and using that in defense of his own corruption and his own actions. So certainly, I think, Johan, as I'm sure you very well know, that campaign was, I think, so successful in that it embedded itself in our national psyche and showed those who would perpetrate disinformation and use it for political means just exactly what works and what doesn't. And so often what that means is division, creating mistrust between different groups and communities, sowing hatred, which unfortunately I think in the world today we're seeing so much more of. And certainly a very successful strategy, which we were very, very, I think we should all be very proud to say South Africans were able to defeat ultimately. But certainly that legacy is still with us, I think.
One point I'd like to add to that, Bill, and I think you probably back me up on this. So much of the work that big PR companies used to do is now insourced, not just by governments, not just by political parties, but also by corporates as well. We now understand that messaging is the weapon. And I think this is the transition that's been made over the past 15, 20 years, which is the really, really dangerous transition. And that is, in terms of strategic communications, that has become the weapon of choice. So in other words, forget all the kinetic weapons. They're wonderful and they make for great television. But the truth of the matter is that real malevolent actors understand that your strategic communications are where the real goods are. In other words, companies like Bell Pottinger, like Cambridge Analytica and others, the job is to turn us, your average information consumer, into the bullet, right? And I think that stuff has become so de rigueur, so obvious that it's now being insourced. And the likes of Bell Pottinger, their legacy is the fact that now everybody can do it and everybody does it.
Yeah,
it's interesting, the everybody blames all this misinformation stuff on the Russians, but it was developed here in the UK, where I am.
Absolutely.
It was invented by this guy. He was the one who cooked it all up, not the Russians.
But where did the Russians go for great disinformation? They went to the British.
Yeah.
Well, the Russians aren't actually great innovators in a lot of things, but they once they sort of figure out a sort of modus operandi, they just use it and use it and use it again. But another theme which I was sort of interested in discussing with you is, and it wasn't so well played out in the movie, but just in terms of real life out there, I've always tried to understand what Putin had over Zuma that allowed South Africa to mortgage the next 200 years for your energy supply.
Now you're really getting into our country gossip now,
Yeah.
Bill. I mean, this is going deep. Rich?
Look, the nuclear deal was the big boogeyman of the Zuma era. Obviously, there was trillions of rand to be stolen effectively in setting up a nuclear deal. A very wise man once said to me, there is a lot of money to be made, not just in the nuclear deal itself, but in trying to get the nuclear deal set up. So I think that was effectively the play. They would have loved that deal to go through. I don't think Putin had necessarily anything on Zuma. I think that's probably a bit of a stretch. But what they certainly had was the fact that this deal could be done in a way that would be very, very beneficial to the Russians and extraordinarily beneficial to the Gupta syndicate. So it's nothing more complicated than that. They tried everything they could to get that deal through. And there's still remnants of it that are kind of like still fighting their way through the ANC. But I think there's, hopefully it's well and truly dead. And after COVID-19, I don't even think that there's a pie in the sky chance that, I mean, we'd struggle to get a plug-in fan right now, never mind a nuclear generator.
But do the Russians continue to have some sway or influence or their tentacles into the post-Zuma bureaucracy, government, parliament,
Absolutely.
whatever?
Yeah, the answer is yes, and there are a lot of Vladimir Putin fanboys within the ANC. A lot of my journalistic colleagues and probably some other people will know that a very, very prominent member of the Gupta syndicate who worked in government actually had the Kremlin as his icon on his WhatsApp group, on his WhatsApp account. So that's the kind of fanboy action we're talking about. There is a deep connection in factions of the ANC towards Russia, but also, within the African National Congress, there has been a turning away from the West, in some cases for outstanding reasons. But within the ANC right now, there are deep, deep links to the Russians, and those aren't going anywhere. And as you know, Bill, the Russians are making greater and more skillful incursions into Africa, to the extent that I'd argue we are nudging our way towards a new version of a Cold War here on this continent.
It's really interesting and ironic because I can understand the history when the communists, the Soviet Union, the communists supported the ANC, but there's nothing. There is no common values between the sort of Putin mafia state and the and whatever the sort of core values are of the ANC. There's no connection to it whatsoever, and it's remarkable that exists. And you're absolutely right about this whole African thing. I mean, it's Putin has this friend. They call him his chef. His name is Prigozhin, and Prigozhin is running around Africa now to like little countries that no one's paying any attention to, like Mozambique. There was a presidential election, and some emails leaked where apparently they were like funding every single presidential candidate. They're totally hedging their bets so that whoever won would be beholden to them afterwards. And South Sudan, Angola, and many other places that we don't even know. I mean, the Russians are, lining all this stuff up and for all sorts of nefarious reasons that we haven't even seen yet.
Well, give Lord Bell, sorry, Diana, just give Lord Bell credit. He would hedge his bets. He'd just pay off one political party. So that's a good thing. There is a question, Diana, if you don't mind, from Mandy Baldry, which asks, does the Russian government plant or secure people favorable to their causes in countries like South Africa to promote the Russian government in a seemingly benign bottom-up way? The answer is, of course, but not just the Russians. Everybody does that. So that kind of thing obviously goes on. Our argument would be that within a faction of the ANC, that those relationships are a tad more pernicious than they ought to be.
Absolutely. And I think it comes back to something else that we found not surprising, but certainly obviously very, very troubling in the film was, what was bigger than the 94 election and Bell's involvement in that, which of course had massive implications for South Africa, as we show in the film. The National Party, which was the government of apartheid, were able to maintain was a real say, a very important say in how the Constitution was written and what subsequently came to be entrenched, which has always been held up as this incredibly liberal, progressive document, was in fact very protective of the one thing that that party and their constituents cared most about, which was ownership of property and land rights, and the ability to maintain economic control of the country, which we've very much seen come to pass, and is very much the case still today, that the economic distinctions are still drawn along racial lines. But more so than that, I think by Bell coming to South Africa and seeing what was possible in that process, much with what's happening with Russia today, they were able to look at where democracies, young democracies, were going into election cycles and were vulnerable and able to say, well, hey, we have this skill set. We did this work in South Africa. We were able to plan the communications and the strategy around their election. Why don't we come in and help you? And you have an amazing resource here in your platinum and titanium. We have a great businessman client who would be so interested in hearing more about how to wrangle a deal. So I think certainly this happens time and again, and it's not unique to Africa, certainly, but I just think there are so many vulnerable democracies and political systems that are open to so much abuse that it is very easy, if you're coming in as a strong man and saying, look at all the things that we could do for you, and that's it. You sell your soul, and it becomes extremely convoluted and extremely corrupt, and that's what we're seeing. So certainly not an original concept by any stretch.
No, I mean there's such parallels between South Africa and Russia.
Absolutely.
As you were saying before we came on live, South Africa is South Africa is Russia with good weather.
Yeah, getting to be that way, I think, certainly not surprising these days. But Bill, so I'm curious in terms of where you see the next few years, the Magnitsky Act and the work that you're doing in that regard. What are your next big goals? What are you hoping to further in terms of building on the work that you've been doing?
So for those who don't know me, so the Magnitsky Act was named after my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky, who was murdered in Russian police custody 11 years ago. And so my life has now been moved from a track of being a businessman to being a justice activist. And my main and there's probably not that many hedge fund managers that became full-time justice activists. I think I'm in a club of like one or two. But the main goal of my activism is to get the Magnitsky Act passed in as many countries as possible. And the reason is because if we have just the Americans sanctioning somebody, that's great, and it has big impact and it causes trouble for bad guys. But what we found is that people who were on the U.S. Magnitsky list were still traveling to Europe and still, buying or visiting their villas in the south of France, and that I found to be really unpleasant and frustrating. And so my goal has been to get the Magnitsky Act passed in all the countries where bad guys would want to go.
Right.
And so and that may be because they're good places to visit as tourists, or maybe because they're good places to keep your money because they're safe, good legal systems. Because and one really important point is that crooks generally don't want to keep their money in their own country where they've stolen it, because as easily as they stole it, it can be stolen from them. And so they want, they want to violate everyone's rights and human rights and legal rights and property rights. And then they want to keep their money and their families in places where there's good human rights and legal rights and property rights, so they can defend themselves. It's really, it's like, so my goal is to try to find all the countries in the world that they'd want to go to, and then engage with the lawmakers in those countries and get the Magnitsky Act in place. And so we've succeeded so far in 7 countries: the United States, Canada, Great Britain, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and sort of out of nowhere, Kosovo. And and that was one I actually didn't even work on. The foreign minister of Kosovo just announced.
Voluntary.
Apparently he had his own troubles with Putin and decided it would be a good idea. But as I mentioned, that doesn't complete the world. It's not like those are the only places where people want to keep their money. They want to keep their money for sure in Europe, and so the EU is the grand prize, really, because we get 27 countries in one if we get the EU to do it. And the EU, in December of last year, after 10 years of trips to Brussels and op-eds and articles and meetings with parliamentarians and meetings with government and so on and so forth, they finally announced in principle that they were going to do a Magnitsky Act in December. And the first draft of the Magnitsky Act has been distributed to all the member states last week. And so I think that we're going to get it maybe this year, maybe even this fall, which would be a huge coup. Now, getting it doesn't mean that much, because once you have it, you have to actually sanction people,
right?
And that's the next step.
So it becomes about political will, of course, right? And actually getting not just the sign off, but the buy-in from all of these states. And how are you finding? I mean, in the seven states that you've won so far, how are you finding that it's enthusiastically taken up, or is there a sense
in different places in different ways? So, for example, the United States, we had this big argument about may versus shall, and then all of a sudden, you get a new set of people coming into the government, and it's interesting because there's a lot of, whether you like or hate Donald Trump, there were a lot of very reasonable bureaucrats in his government who took the Magnitsky Act while he was busy tweeting about porn stars. They took the Magnitsky Act and implemented it and added like 200 people to the Magnitsky list, and so it turned out to be much more robust. And I remember going to meet the person who was doing the targeting in the Treasury Department, and she's no longer there. But when I was there, I was saying, this is just wonderful what you're doing. And she said, well, I've got the best job in the world going after the bad guys. It's really wonderful. We any more, evidence and stories and names you can come up with, please hand them in, because we want to use this really aggressively. And I said, wow, this is a lot different than what it was like, a few years back. Now, on the flip side, the UK passed the Magnitsky Act in 2018, and it took more than 2 years to get them to add the first people to their Magnitsky list, and they only did it on July 6th this year, and it was like pulling teeth. And part of the reason why it was like pulling teeth is right back to your movie, which is that you have this influence industry. Well, you have money here, money of bad guys, a lot of Russian bad guys, and what I discovered was that they were hiring lawmakers in the House of Lords from both parties to stall the process.
Yeah,
and this is not just me making allegations. We found emails.
Oh, we believe.
Yeah, we believe. Yeah. This is how it works. I mean, the funny thing about Lord Bell is that he was a Luddite. I mean, for a guy whose company exploded because of a bad Twitter campaign, he was a guy who loathed social media, couldn't bear it. He believed that the way you win anything is by buying it. So effectively, in many respects, the geopolitical unit of Bell Pottinger bought stuff. They bought influence. They'd flush money through from other businessmen into election campaigns for favors on the other side. It's a very, very simple sort of chute of cash injections that run from political influences, business people, political parties, and it's a closed loop. The money just flushes through and flushes through and flushes through. So, you're 100% right. So much of influence is just brute cash. It's taking people out, it's smoking cigars with them, it's going to strip clubs, and you can extrapolate the rest from there. It's a very human thing. We're obsessed now, I think, with this notion of technology. And technology, social media, all of that stuff has been a massive force in further weaponizing these dark arts. But I think it's worth noting that so much of this is the fleshy, sweaty grab of human contact. And we should never forget that. Well,
there's one thought I had when I was watching your movie, which is that, yes, that's all true. But technology is also that has this double-edged sword, which is, I guess Bell Pottinger went down because of this email leak, because because all the evidence, I mean, these people can deny until you put an email in front of them and say, this was your email, right?
Right.
Exactly.
Yeah, this is the thing, right? And there's a question here from Colette, which kind of pulls into this. She says, Bill, what advice would you give to us on how to encourage whistleblowers to speak out? And I mean, so much of of the Gupta leaks was the courage of those who brought those leaks forward and risked their lives in doing so, and had their lives completely upended. I mean, they made a pretty big sacrifice in doing that. I'm sure you deal with this all the time, and I'm sure it's important in your work too. Have you got any insight on why would people come forward? How to encourage people in this nexus of money and corruption and disinformation and threats to people's lives, people being poisoned on airlines? Where's the incentive to do things in the national interest or for the public good?
Well, sadly, there is huge disincentives and very few incentives. Most whistleblowers live long or sort of short, lonely, terrible lives. I mean, there's very little upside to being a whistleblower. I wish I could say, I mean, other than the sort of gratification of doing the right thing, you have these terrible consequences for most whistleblowers, and we've seen that. Oh my God, we've seen that in Russia. I mean, the number of people who have been killed, poisoned, imprisoned for blowing the whistle, including my lawyer, Sergei Magnitsky. Sergei Magnitsky blew the whistle on a massive government corruption scheme, thinking that he was a good patriot. And he was arrested, tortured for 358 days, and killed at the age of 37. I'm not trying to like convince people not to be whistleblowers.
A great motivation.
but I would say that it's the world is a very brutal place, and now in spite of that, people continue to come forward and give us information, and sometimes they don't even have to put themselves at risk. We've been able to get lots and lots of leaked emails from so many different sources, and those emails, it's remarkable how sloppy a lot of these people are, these bad guys, when it comes to their technology, and thank God for that, because if they weren't, so many things we would never know about.
Absolutely. I mean, you look at a case like today. I mean, the technology that was used today to poison Andrei Navalny was poison in his cup of tea, which seems to be a favored approach. But I mean, what are your thoughts on what happened today? I think a lot of our viewers are keen to hear your thoughts on this, given that this has happened so many times, as you say.
Well, so I mean, it's interesting that this morning I was on a interview with BBC, and they're saying suspected poisoning. We don't know for sure if he has been poisoned. And it's like, how many times do you have to do that? We don't know for sure. There's another side of the story. I mean, there's literally like 87 examples of Russians poisoning their enemies. There was the Skripals in Salisbury. There was Litvinenko with polonium in London. There was the Peter Verzilov from Pussy Riot, who was poisoned, and they had to fly him to Berlin. There was my friend Vladimir Karamurza, who was poisoned twice in Moscow. There was the former Ukrainian president, Viktor Yushchenko, who was poisoned. There was and it just goes on and on and on and on. Yes, he was poisoned. He was poisoned.
Definitely poisoned.
It was not like a stomach ache. He was poisoned. Yeah. And not only was he poisoned, but he was poisoned by the Russian FSB, the secret police. And he was poisoned on the orders of Vladimir Putin. And why did Vladimir Putin order him to be poisoned? Because Vladimir Putin is freaking out right now. He's watching what's happening in Belarus, the neighboring country, which had a dictator, Lukashenko, for 26 years. He's only been there for 20 years. He's kind of a junior varsity dictator compared to Lukashenko. And he's seeing the whole thing blowing up and thinking to himself, if Lukashenko gets run out of town or arrested or whatever, or deposed, then the Russians are going to say, wait a second, if they can do that in Belarus, why are we tolerating this in Russia? And what Putin's most afraid of is Alexei Navalny leading them towards that revolution, which he could very effectively do. He's a highly effective, highly charismatic, very impressive 44-year-old. He's just come into age, like right now. He's in the right time of his life with the right skills to really be able to do this, and that's why Putin made the order. That's why he was poisoned, and we're all just watching in horror. And this is not the first poisoning we've dealt with among our friends and allies. And I mean, it's very brutal what they've done, and we don't know what the outcome is going to be. The one thing I can say is that he is 44 years old. He's in extremely good physical condition, and that helps a lot when in a situation like this. And so if he can somehow survive the next sort of 48 hours, he might be able to pull through.
Yeah, I mean, it's just a terrible situation. I want to jump back to the whistleblower thing, because I think while your pitch was convincing, Bill, I think there is one or two moderating factors in this, and certainly while South Africa has a relatively sympathetic president sitting on top of us, I think it's worth pushing in a country like this one for regulation that massively protects whistleblowers. The other thing I think we can do is teach our media houses, our free media houses, how to deal with whistleblowers in a way that does everything we can to ensure their safety. In other words, it's very important to know how to file an 800-word story. Of course it is. But I think it's also very, very important to try to entrench the sort of qualities of protection around information, protecting our sources and reminding ourselves how important that is. So I do think there are things that can be done to make more robust protections for whistleblowers. They are the essential undergirding to our democracy. People who will speak out. When fear gets so great that no one speaks out, then your democracy is done. It's finished. It's over.
Mm.
And that's what dictators want to do is to make it so painful and so dangerous that nobody says anything, and then if you don't know it, you can't respond to it.
And I think the Navalny thing is actually an act of massive desperation.
Yes,
I mean that is a broad
absolutely.
daylight mugging without wearing a balaclava. It's astonishing how naked and crass that act is. It's an act of desperation. And yeah, you're right. I think everyone hopes that he pulls through the next 48 hours.
Well, it's also an act of cowardice because Putin is a dictator. He's a killer. Why doesn't he just do it right out in the open and just take responsibility for it instead of like from one side of his mouth he says, yeah, I did it and no one else challenged me, and then the other side of his mouth said, no, not me. That you can't prove it.
Right.
It's food poisoning.
Right. And so it's so brazen at this point. As you say, it's got his fingerprints all over it, and yet he doesn't have the balls to do it himself. I mean, at this stage, it's incredible to see that this is able to happen, and that this is happening still. There's a comment here from Tsietsi and Kondo, and this is a little bit off topic, but the comment is, every political ideology unfortunately has its own sell-by date. South African mainstream politicians have reached that point. And I guess you could very much say that about mainstream politics everywhere, including in Russia. What is the ideology these days? It's the protection of wealth, basically, at all costs, and the protection of position and power. And I think what that means is a real kind of disconnect from the constituency, because people no longer have a way to relate to a way of doing things or see any reason for doing those things other than to protect the wealthy. And that was certainly what Bell's entire role and entire reason for being was to protect the powerful, protect the rich, and in so doing, amass his own wealth. Although he didn't really do that. He wasn't a super wealthy guy, but certainly it meant a lot to him. And I think certainly in Russia, we see that very strongly.
I mean, Bell worked for private interests, and that's how he purchased political parties. Again, it's a very, very simple model.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So look, let's not depress everyone too much, given that the film is already quite intense. Let's talk about. I mean, we get asked about solutions a lot, and as journalists, and you probably feel similar, Bill. It's not. We often feel that it's not our place to mix our work with any kind of activism. Well, in your case, it's a different kind of activism, obviously. But I think the question is such a valid one. Frankly, what do we do now? Understanding this nexus of corruption, disinformation, and the kind of the shoring up of power behind these methods of protection. What does the average citizen do? How do they contribute, and how do they how do they protect themselves from the results of all of this? Any insights, Bill?
Well, I mean, so yeah, the answer is that corruption. A corrupt person can't survive and keep their ill-gotten gains if they knew what they were doing. And so, and it's very hard in this day and age to actually keep people from knowing what these people are doing, and which is where information comes from. So if you can't hide the truth, then what you have to do is then spin the truth or confuse the people to such a degree that they don't have the normal response that you would have seeing something terrible happening. So like in the Magnitsky case, Sergei Magnitsky discovered the theft of $230 million from the Russian government and exposed it. And anyone would say that that's an act of patriotism. And then the Russian government said, no, that's not. They killed him. And the only way that they could then get away with that, stealing the money and killing him, was to try to make him, using this whole disinformation thing, into an evil person. And so they put him on trial 3 years after they killed him, in the first ever trial against a dead man in the history of Russia, to lay out their whole like alternative reality, alternative universe of Sergei Magnitsky was a criminal who was stealing from the Russian government. No, he's not. He wasn't a whistleblower. He didn't give his life for this. Because there's no other way that they could survive as a government if the story was different. And so then I've spent the last 10 years, and so coming back to your question, what can you do is, if there's disinformation, you need to fight back with information.
Right.
And that means the truth. And we've actually succeeded to, I think, a greater extent than I would have imagined, which is that we just put facts, figures, information out there to such a degree, and in a certain way, because I was highly motivated and I made this my life's work, I was able to fight back against the disinformation and provide the information. And I would say that 98% of the world knows the true story of what happened to Sergei Magnitsky and doesn't buy the Kremlin version. And so, in small ways and large ways, if one encounters disinformation, the best thing to do is to fight back with information.
Absolutely.
That's what I've done as a campaigner, and that's what everyone can do in their own way.
Absolutely. And I think in the reporting that we've done subsequent to the film, subsequent to production, which ended, I guess, Rich, middle of last year. We've been chatting to people about what's transpired. 2016 was obviously such an incredibly seminal year in so many ways. But at the time, the misinformation that was, the disinformation that was being used was fairly, it was a new form, and there was really very, very little political or social understanding of it, or will to really understand the power of it, and or where it was coming from, and how it was being used, and how deeply. And so there was really no one fighting those battles. And what we've subsequently learned, and I think that is slowly but surely becoming clear, although we do need a much, much bigger undertaking from our social media and our tech companies to help this cause, is professionals who are being hired by NGOs, by companies to hunt this stuff, frankly, online, to go to the source, find out who these actors, these so-called bad actors are, who are seeding this information into our mainstream through Twitter, through Facebook, particularly Facebook, and getting the buy-in of the tech companies, as I say, not even close to enough yet. The point is that there's now an understanding of how this works, the various different techniques. Yes, they're changing all the time, but you've got a whole team of people from around the world who have dedicated their careers to understanding it and fighting back, which we didn't have 3 years ago. So, I think in many ways there's not a lot of new stuff that's coming up, or new players in the game that aren't known about, that aren't very quickly uncovered. We had a case here recently with Rich, maybe you could talk about this, the Ulerato Pillay campaign. I mean, that's been very interesting to track.
One of our colleagues, Jessica Bezadenhost, did a great expose on a massive disinformation campaign, which is targeting foreign nationals in this country. So a xenophobic campaign Similar in character to what Bell Pottinger was doing, certainly taking some of the stuff from their playbook, but very narrowly focused against foreign nationals. A flat-out xenophobic Twitter campaign that's actually been pretty successful and gained a lot of traction. So these tools are still being used, but I think Diane is 100% right. We are becoming much, much more skillful in being able to combat them, much, much more skillful as journalists, and also as threat hunters in other areas of being able to discern these campaigns, track them down, battle them, and alert the authorities. One thing I would add, and I think where you're an inspiration, Bill, is the fact that when you pair up legislation with information, you start having very, very powerful tools. And again, if corruption and disinformation go hand in hand, I think information and legislation can go, or smart legislation can go hand in hand as well. And I think that's the thing that the Magnitsky Act teaches us, is that if you hammer the information through, and you were very, very good at playing the press. Did I say playing the press? Working with the press to get great stories out there, stories that were truthful, stories that extended a very, very powerful, but also very transformative narrative. And you paired that up with a real hammer of a legislative tool that now is gaining traction all over the world. Yeah. So I think we tend to get a little down in our soup about how things are going, but it's clear that, first of all, as Diana noted, we're starting to understand and address the threats that we face, certainly on a technological level, and we're starting to understand how to use legislative tools to combat them.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, and I think Bill, in so many ways you've blazed a trail, and I think there's a lot of work that can stem from your example, which would be so crucial.
Well, we've created a good template for everybody to use, and given people a lot of hope all over the world. The Uyghurs in China, the opposition in Venezuela, the people demonstrating in Belarus, all of them now have a tool to even out the playing field. Maybe not perfectly, but a lot better than before, where nobody could do anything. And it's really wonderful to watch the bad guys, how upset they get when they get sanctioned on the Magnitsky list, and how much it disrupts their lives. And chalk one up for the good guys on this front. Absolutely.
Something that we've been talking a lot about between the two of us, but also in our larger organization at Daily Maverick, is, if corruption were to be, universally condemned in a meaningful way, again, using your example of legislation to kind of fight that battle, something like getting corruption recognized as a human rights violation, in the upper echelons of international legislation, would something like that go some way in starting to create a kind of a fight back narrative, or just essentially just making it a topic of conversation that becomes tangible and universal? I think could be something to work towards.
Well, corruption and human rights violations are intimately intertwined. So in the case of Sergei Magnitsky, he discovered a $230 million corruption scheme. He exposed it, and then he was tortured and killed. So there's corruption and there's human rights violations.
There you go.
It's all packaged up together. And the Magnitsky Act in Canada and in the United States include corruption and human rights violations. It doesn't in the EU version or the UK version. And so one of my big goals is to make sure that all the versions include corruption, because you can't separate out the two. And it's kleptocracy and corruption are all total drivers of most of the terrible things that go on.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Well, it looks like we've sadly reached the end of our hour. Bill, before we close, is there anything else that you'd like to add? I'm sad to end the conversation here. It's so interesting, but
so the one country where I also want to get the Magnitsky Act is in South Africa.
Please. Yeah, we need it. Certainly do.
So if there are any members of Parliament listening in, I'm looking for parliamentary allies, please let me know however you can get in touch. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Bill.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Bill. And to all audience, thank you so much for joining us. It's been great to see all your comments. I'm sorry we couldn't get to everything. I think we'd be here for another couple of hours if we had to go through everything. I know there were a lot of questions about China and some really interesting stuff that we unfortunately couldn't get to tonight. There's only so many things we can add into an hour. But it's been so fantastic to have this chat. Bill Browder, thank you so much to Daily Maverick for hosting this on their platform. We're so appreciative as always. And to Caveat Legal for sponsoring this Q&A. It's been great to be able to have this conversation after Influence premiered here in South Africa tonight at the Encounters Film Festival. And on behalf of our producers, Neille Brunt and Bob Moore at iSteel Film and Storyscope, Richard and I are so happy to have been here. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Bill.
Thank you.